Wow, I blinked and 2 months have disappeared. Started off, just after Hero Roundtable in Yarram, heading to Michigan, where we spoke to Real Estate One people at Soundboard, famous place in downtown Detroit. Got to see some snow and catch up with people from Ford, from Hero Construction Company, and touch in with Hero Roundtable Michigan as well. So back to weekly videos this week, an interview between Anthony Simeone, Ari Kohen, myself on Stoicism.
Okay, welcome to Around the Table. Once again, we have two guests this week, Ari Kohen in Nebraska and Anthony Simeone in Pennsylvania?
Philadelphia area, metro area, yeah.
Got the state right.
Close enough.
We're going to talk about Stoicism, and it's a becoming quite a popular topic amongst certain populations, and we'll get into that in a little while. So you may have encountered the idea of Stoic philosophy recently, but if you haven't, more than likely your idea of Stoic behavior is pretty entrenched, and we're here to change that today, give you a different definition of what it is to be Stoic. So Ari, can you get us started with who these Stoic philosophers were, where they were, and when they were?
Sure. So there were a lot of sort of classical Stoic philosophers. Stoicism was really founded in early 3rd century BCE by Zeno of Citium, and his school was in Athens. There were Stoic philosophers for several hundred years thereafter, probably until sort of the 3rd century, and it was mostly Greece and Rome, but also around that area, right? So you had Stoic philosophers in Carthage, in Babylon, in Rhodes, that whole kind of area. The most famous Stoic philosophers, apart from Zeno, you had Cato the Younger, you had Seneca, probably one of the most famous, of course, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Those are really the kind of Stoic examples that everybody thinks of, I guess, when they're thinking of classic Stoic philosophy. And then, of course, there was a kind of a neo-Stoic movement in and around the Renaissance era, and now, as you alluded to, Matt, a kind of modern Stoic revival, if you will. So, yeah, maybe that's the beginning you were looking for.
It is indeed. So we're recording today on the 25th of April, where I am, and where I am also is that's quite a day to evoke the idea of Stoicism. It's a remembrance of war, and was started with World War One. It's Anzac Day, so when Australia and New Zealand troops were kind of fed to the slaughter by the British at Gallipoli, and the idea that Stoic, I'm just going to go, I'm going to face my destiny, as my duty, just go over the top of the trenches and know that I'm going to die. So I think that's a lot of what people think about here, especially today, around the word Stoic. And probably 5-10 years ago, that would have been what came to mind for me, but now it's probably a bust of Marcus Aurelius or something like that. Anthony, can you give us an intro into what it really is? What was the Stoic philosophy about?
The Stoics classically really were about controlling emotions. So reason was sort of the highest virtue, and control of your emotions was paramount. So that to really live a good life, you had to be rational, You had to be sort of indifferent to the vicissitudes of life and fate and fortune and chance. So you had to greet anything that came into your life with sort of indifference and calm, control, discipline, and it had to be a regular practice that you learned and really focused on the highest virtue of being in control of your emotions. So that's really what I feel like is what the classic definition of it, as far as any of the people from Zeno onward that Ari just mentioned. And we can talk about, like you said, how that's maybe changed. I have my own opinions on that. We can delve into that as we go forward. But if you want to start with what I feel like it meant, that's really what the foundational ideas were.
Ari, have you got anything to add there? Is that a pretty good starting point?
No, I think that's a great starting point. I mean, there are a lot of ideas that all are kind of find themselves under the umbrella of Stoicism. But when people think of Stoicism, they typically think about this kind of the notion of Stoic calm, right? I think, Anthony, you said a kind of indifference. You might think of it as a kind of resilience to the vicissitudes of fortune or something like that, right? One can't control what is about to happen, but instead you have to sort of accept the moment as it presents itself. I think that's really the best and most common way of thinking about how one approaches one's life stoically.
And so this sort of stereotypical idea of the Stoic being sort of straight-faced, standing in the rain and not being bothered, and generally being I feel sort of a miserable person. That's not really what they were saying, right? That there was joy in the Stoics' lives as well. Anthony, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, just there was happiness. There was happiness in being prepared and resilient. That's kind of the modern buzzword that Ari mentioned. The resilience is what we would call it now. And I think that the fallacy that we're encountering with some groups that claim to be Stoic, I really think that Stoic is actually a euphemism for being cynical for a lot of people today. A lot of guys and a lot of men in certain men's groups would say that Stoicism is about stuffing down your emotions. Don't be a wimp, to use a lighter term for it. Don't be, stuff it down. Don't show emotions. Don't show weakness. Emotions as weakness. So, and I think a lot of pathology comes from that, stuffing down emotions. I'm sure Ari could speak better to that than I can. Me being a layperson and having experience just stuffing down my emotions and again, the pathology that can come from that. I don't think the Stoics were about ignoring the existence of your emotions. It was more like learning from them, being in control of them, and prioritizing control of emotions and respect for them versus this cynicism, like you said, being miserable, standing in the rain. So I think that's the real gulf between what the traditional Stoics meant by Stoicism and the joy that they got out of it being, a joyless world today where you're just suffering and you have to bear it and like a man and, stuff all your emotions down. That's not what the Stoics intended or how they embodied it.
So I think we'll get to the modern interpretation in a few minutes, I think, because there are a few groups that are taking it on. Ari, I saw you nodding a lot there. Have you got some more to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's quite right. The idea is not to be, I think Anthony said, controlled, right, by your desire for pleasure or by your concern or your fear, especially your fear of pain or suffering, right? That instead. You should kind of approach the world in a kind of rational way, right? Use your mind, understand the world around you, but there's also a happiness that Stoicism kind of preaches, right? It's that happiness in not thinking about what the future holds, but instead living in the present, right? So this idea that one cannot be happy as a Stoic, I think is a misunderstanding of classical Stoicism, right? If you read Seneca, if you read Epictetus, there's absolutely happiness to be found. That happiness is found in living virtuously, right? So virtue is the is the approach to living a happy life, and part of that is of course a kind of emotional resilience, right? Not getting bogged down in whatever bad things might be happening or potentially could be on the horizon, but instead focusing on what's going on around you at that time.
So you've both mentioned the idea of control, and that it's kind of I get the sense a lot of the Stoic philosophers were kind of amused by that idea that people thought they could control things that they couldn't. So basically they boil it down to the idea that the only thing you can control is your mind, right? So you can't control people's actions, but you can control your reaction to their actions. You can't control the weather, but you can decide how you're going to react to the weather, how you're going to consider it, what you're going to let it do to you. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I would totally agree. It's about, embracing what comes and embracing the present, embracing the moment, and embracing your own fallibility, embracing your emotions so that they move through you. And that's how you control them, quote unquote. You really don't control them. You let them be what they are, experience them, and realize that you will be there after they leave, after the storm leaves, and through that process of just being okay with your emotions as they come to you, you just become resilient to that. And you say, okay, I'm feeling this way, and it, maybe if it's an unpleasant feeling, it sucks, but it doesn't control me. I get to choose how I react to it. And I'm a huge fan of Viktor Frankl's work and logotherapy and his story about what he went through in the Holocaust. And he's sort of the ultimate sort of lesson, I feel like, in the modern age of you cannot control your circumstances, and those were some horrific circumstances that he lived through, and many other Jewish people and other ethnicities through that time. But he really preached that when he saw people who gave up hope and who let the circumstances destroy them, whereas he said, okay, there's something beyond this that I can get to, that I can look forward to, and I get to control. They can't take away my memories, and they're a good source of pleasure for me, so they can't take that. They can't take how I react to what they're doing to me. So that's really is Stoicism, not stuffing things down, but and not ignoring things and just saying that everything's miserable. It's the world is what it is. It's sort of a blank slate, and it gives what it gives, and I will take it all, good or bad, and choose and have that. That's the power of choice, and choose how I react to things and how I. And these are my parameters for how I want to show up in the world, and live by that.
I should say too, and this is not perhaps directly related to what we've been talking about, but the Stoics were quite radical in a number of ways in their own time. And for me, I would say the most notable is that the Stoics, in contrast to most of the philosophers who were teaching around that time, the Stoics were egalitarian. The way that they thought about humanity was that people were the equals of one another, right? And the Stoics even extended that to people who existed in a condition of slavery at the time, right? The Stoic tradition taught that everybody was a product of nature, and as a result, everybody was the equal of everybody else. And this, of course, is really, really radical. If you contrast this, Zeno's teaching, the teaching of the Stoics, with Aristotelian thoughts on, for example, natural slavery, it's a huge difference. So there was a real kind of radical approach to not just the way that one should engage with the world around oneself, but the way that ultimately the way the world worked, right? The role of nature. So a lot of people think of Stoicism as purely a kind of individualistic doctrine, but I think that there's this other point to be made as well, right? When you can find a lot of really interesting and quite radical material in Stoicism that deals with interpersonal relationships. So I just thought I would flag that as well.
Well, I think that brings up something I wanted to note as well, is that those big names, the rock stars of the Stoic world, were from very different social backgrounds, right? So you had Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor of the world essentially at that time, taking notes to himself about the philosophy. Was it Cato that was an escaped slave? Someone was an escaped slave out of those five.
It was not Cato.
Not Cato. Okay.
This is Cato the Younger, who was most famously he was he was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, and a kind of an antagonist of Caesar's.
What, Epictetus maybe? I'm sure I read that one of them was
it was Epictetus.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the fact that people are coming to this thought from very different angles is really interesting to me. I think the other thing that I want to jump into is kind of their sense of perspective as well, related to the universe and to time. That they were very aware that their life was a short blip in the enormity of everything, both at the time and then in the future. They didn't expect people to be talking about them, and they knew that eventually even the most famous names disappear, right? That that perspective that gave them the sort of freedom to not worry about all the little injuries that they suffered.
Yeah, it was sort of a memento mori, right? I mean, and Marcus Aurelius said, do not live as if you have 1,000 years, or something to that effect, depending on the translation you read. But yeah, it's this idea that, you remember you will die, and that makes life, you can either allow that to make life a bitter thing, or you can make that idea and that remembrance that life is fleeting be a goad for you to live well and to live with a full life, rather than have you sink into despair and waste your life contemplating your demise, your inevitable death.
The Memento Mori is definitely something we've seen over the centuries as well, and I think is making a comeback now, in the form of coins that people are printing and having on them. What was the purpose of the Memento Mori?
I mean, literally means, remember you will die. I mean, it's just this, and there's people are tattooing it on themselves, and lots of little different trinkets now to. And I mean, modern life has made us so divorced from death. Generally, none of us really see a dead body or death unless you're in a hospice situation, which I actually had experience with one of my loved ones. But I mean, most of the time that we are very separated from death, unlike our ancestors, and definitely unlike what the Stoics would have seen. Death is sort of something that you experience viscerally right in front of you on a more regular basis in ancient times. So, but it was literally, that's just remember that it was any kind of remembrance of just the fleeting nature of life. And yeah, it was powerful for them, and I think it's making quite a comeback. I mean, I don't know if you consider, YOLO might be sort of the modern social media equivalent, meme or hashtag equivalent of Memento Mori, but I guess you could do worse than just live frivolously.
But it was that recognition, constant recognition that life is going to end for you, and that it could end tomorrow, it could end today. So it was that act, and this goes across a lot of philosophies, right? Act today as you would want to in 10 years if you got that chance, or do what you need to do. Any thoughts there, Ari, on the Memento Mori?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is to think about how that plays out today, right? The way that I would say, even if we could say, as Anthony does, that it's kind of making a little bit of a comeback, I would say that really in some ways, this is the part of Stoicism from which we remain still very disconnected, because for most people, certainly the people that I interact with in a classroom, for example, death is very far removed from their experience, and it's not something that they're thinking about, right? If you ask young people today about their plans or why they're making the choices they're making, they're not thinking about having a limited number of choices to make over the course of a lifetime, right? They see life stretching out before them. They're not thinking that they should live every day, have every conversation as if it might be the last one. And I think that this really, I think this is the part of Stoicism in some ways that's still hard for people to connect to, because the finitude of human existence is something that is not present in so many people's daily lives. We have done an incredible job over the centuries keeping ourselves away from the reality of death. Death is something that happens typically out of most people's view. It's even depictions of it in film or in television tends to be very fictionalized and in a lot of cases sanitized. So it's the part that I think is hardest for us. It's easy enough to say, try to be calm and not be driven around by your emotions and your passions and so on. People can get their heads around that in a way that maybe they can't so much. The inevitability of death and because the presence of it it's not something we deal with very much.
Well, and it's hard to imagine everything ending tomorrow. That's a very hard concept to get around. But even the length of life for the average life is so big that it's hard to get your head around as well. I've got a tab that whenever I open a new tab on Chrome, it shows me how many days I have left to live according to their estimations, and it counts down by the second. So while it's open, it's counting down. My daughter hates it because mortality for a 9-year-old is the worst. But I can't motivate myself by the fact that I've got 11,400 days left, and I imagine the purpose of that plugin is that the counter is going down. So if I can be reminded that seconds are disappearing while you're not doing whatever you need to do, that might be able to help. Let's jump onto another subject, because I want to bring this back around to heroism and how it relates to heroism training. The other tenet I think is the thinking about the worst that could happen, and either mapping it out in your head, going to the end of that event, or experiencing the thing that you fear, whether that's poverty. So I know some of the Stoics, despite having plenty of money, would spend a couple of days each month sleeping on the floor and eating out of the dog's bowl or something along those lines, to say, well, is this as bad as, is this what I'm fearing? Can you guys expand on any of that a little bit, that thinking through the worst case scenarios?
Yeah, that's really, as far as the discipline of which I'm really into, positive psychology, they really have an exercise where you kind of go into best case, worst case scenarios. It's one of the tools, one of the positive psychology interventions that I learned about, where it's, we have a tendency, we have a negativity bias that we evolved to have to protect us and help us survive, but now it's sort of, I wouldn't say it's quite vestigial. We still need that in some cases in the modern world, as far as the negativity bias is concerned. but we're kind of firing it off all the time, and overstimulating it with the 24-hour news cycle and everything. So I think people, especially today, tend to catastrophize, and we evolved to be that way. But now I think we need classical Stoicism more than ever in that regard, where you can step back, be almost a passive observer for your own life and your own environment, and say, okay, what is the best case scenario and what is the worst case scenario here? So you explore it. So it's no longer an unknown, something lurking, a boogeyman. If you map it out and you really bring and drag into the light, these things you're fearing, then you can contrast it with, okay, well, what could go right? What could go really right? So it's this sense of balance that I think that the Stoics would have appreciated, so it's that balancing out that human evolved tendency to catastrophize and to have that negativity bias with, consciously using, your rationality and, the more positive emotions to counterbalance things. I think that's sort of from this positive psychology perspective that's, sort of growing in popularity, and it's been around for a couple decades, but it's really kind of gaining steam now.
And the whole notion of thinking through and trying to experience in some way what the worst possible outcome could be is I don't know what the right word I'm looking for would be, but it has a kind of prioritizing effect, maybe, that enables you to think about what what it is that is truly the worst thing for you. What are the things that you really fear, and how can you deal with those things, right? Again, this sort of speaks to that kind of central tenet of Stoicism that rather than having that emotion of fear, kind of washing over you and trying to deal with it as it's happening, in its extremity, in some sense, planning it out, mapping it out, knowing that even the thing that you think is going to be the most harmful or the most difficult for you, when you actually work your way through it intellectually, it prepares you in some ways for the actual event if it comes, and that allows you to to work through it in a much more sort of calm and rational manner.
Yeah, and I guess this is where I'd like to transition into some of the hero relatability here, and when I was first reading about that, the idea of heroic imagination really came to mind. That idea that if you imagine these bad things happening and then how you would react, it kind of gives you that shortcut to acting instead of thinking. So if you've practiced through, this is what I would do when I see a car accident, then when the car accident happens, you're much more likely to act and do the right thing. There's less chance of panic. There's less freezing in the trying to think through whatever you're going to do. And I think that's obviously played out in military training and first responder training. They're constantly repeating incidents to make that an automatic response, right?
Yeah, it's sort of, you can call it muscle memory, but you can also call it mental simulation, so if you're more into sort of, I think it's a woo-woo concept that people really think they relegate it to sort of new age. It's visualization. Visualization is mental simulation. So if you can mentally simulate scenarios and things like that you might encounter in life before they happen. So, if it's a business meeting or something, yes, you can anticipate it has a set date. Something for first responders or an emergency or a crisis you can't really anticipate, but you can still practice for eventualities and potentialities. But yeah, it's mental simulation is something that, again, we're built to do and to predict and to kind of thin slice, circumstances. All those concepts are something that we can utilize, and and it's that it's there for a reason. And I think that people can be using it, lay people can be using it. It's not just for, I think that's the lesson of heroism that I always push for. It's everyday heroism, and it's the banality of heroism that Phil Zimbardo talks about. It's that anyone can have, it's not about being a hero for the accolades. It's about following the virtues of heroism and, planning for how you would act with those virtues in mind.
What do you think, Ari?
I agree. No, I think Anthony says that very well. I don't have a lot to add, so I won't. I really, no, I think that was very well said.
So let me throw to you then, Ari, going back to the Memento Mori and the realization of mortality. I think you've talked about that before in terms of the type of person who's likely to act heroically as one who's aware of their mortality, who's confronted it, who's faced it. So how do we, I'll expand on that.
Well, yeah, no, it's something that I talk about all the time, and it goes back, again, like we're talking about classical philosophy, this all goes back to those early Western civilization texts, right? I always go back to the Iliad and what we learn from the example of Achilles, right? That Achilles is a very unique character in Greek mythology the he has a choice to make about his fate, and most people you don't get a choice, right? That's the sad tale of Oedipus, for example. You can't outrun your fate, but Achilles he has a choice to make, and in both cases he knows that he dies, right? Because all human beings die. The question is what kind of life he wants to live. And I think that there's a real virtue in teaching that example, because most people don't spend time thinking about the kind of life they want to live, because they don't consider that at some point they won't be living anymore, right? That all of the choices that you make, you have to have them amount to something. Life shouldn't simply be a long list of choices that happened sort of randomly, right? It's entirely possible. I talk with my students about this all the time. We're finishing up a semester here, and we've been reading Nietzsche, and we talk about this all the time, that it is entirely possible to live an entire human life where you get out of bed in the morning, you make your breakfast, you send the kids off to school, you go to work, you do your job, you come home, you feed the kids dinner, you go, you put them to bed, you watch television, and you go to bed, and then you get up the next morning and you do exactly the same thing again, and you just keep doing it until you're done, without stopping to think about what that life equaled, right? If we only have one go around at this, what do you want it to have amounted to, right? What do you want it all to have meant? What's the contribution that you've made in your time on this earth? Those are questions that arise for people at certain moments. But if you think critically about mortality, you can kind of control when that kind of issue arises for you, and you can be the kind of person who makes a real determination for him or herself about the kind of life you'll live. I think that those are the kind of people who have done that work, people who have confronted the fact that you only have so many choices to make before you're out of time. Those are the people who make the hard choices when they're confronted with, for example, an opportunity to make a big sacrifice or take a big risk to, in the cases that we talk about, to help someone or to save a life or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, I think that that brush with death that people can have can really be a determining factor for whether they act heroically on behalf of others, right? I think what you were saying about the getting up and doing the same thing over and over again, Seneca had a line about that if are you scared of dying? Well, tell me, is the kind of life you lead really any different than being dead? And so I think the other thing that we didn't really touch on with the Stoics was the value they placed on virtue, living a virtuous life and making those virtuous choices regardless of that risk. So I think that life choice thing, and that's that hard thing, because we can get sucked into just doing the day and getting the day done and getting through another one. And even though that number's really high on my Chrome tab, it's still going down each time that I don't put a day's effort into having that life that was worth living, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's jump into the kind of people that are using this philosophy today, that are bringing it back into vogue. There's been articles in all the big American newspapers, and NFL teams are certainly using it a lot. Bill Belichick, I think, was a big proponent. NBA teams as well. But I think the big one that I'm seeing that is maybe warping it a little bit, and this is maybe Anthony, where you can chime in as well, is this sort of startup business culture, where it's generally young men who seem to be using it to convince themselves to just do really well at business, be a very successful individual, make lots of money, and then you can just relax in the times that you're not making lots and lots of money. So I see that a lot, and obviously you're seeing it in men's sort of power groups as well. So what are you seeing? The modern where are you seeing modern Stoicism, and are there any positive outposts of it?
I really think that Stoicism, as far as some groups are interpreting it, again, like I mentioned earlier, it's really getting muddy. The philosophy is getting muddied with this, machismo mentality for men. It's getting, it's about stuffing down your emotions, and it's about not being weak or asking for help or appearing, again, which I think is totally divorced from what Stoicism, as we've been describing it, and classically was meant to be. It's being obliterated by this false bravado, and it's just this divorcing yourself from what makes you human, which is your emotions. It's your rationality makes you human, your emotions make you human. That the dynamics between your rationality and your irrational self, the fight flight response and your higher mind, that's supposed to be a flow. It's not supposed to be. You're not supposed to remove either side of that. It's like the yin and the yang. It's this homeodynamics. We think of homeostasis, but actually the mind and the body are in a dynamic flux. So I really feel like the reason why everyone, the APA, the American Psychological Association, they said Stoicism was sort of one of the parts of, toxic masculinity, right? Which is also another huge time bomb and, hot potato that no one wants to talk about. But they didn't mean Stoicism in the classical sense. They meant this bastardized interpretation of it, where you're stuffing down your emotions and which is, again, the root to pathology and is unnatural. It's, one of my big influences is actually the novel Dune by Frank Herbert. And I don't know if anyone's read it. If either of you have read it, but there's a chant that Paul Atreides, the main character, does that he was taught. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that leads to total annihilation. Something like that. I will face my fear, or let it flow through me, and when it's gone, only I will remain. So emotions have a purpose. They have a place. They are part of what it means to be alive, and you can watch them, you can observe them, you can accept them, embrace them, let them flow through you, and you will still be there. That is very different from, I'm going to stuff my emotions down, I'm not going to feel, and that's Stoic. No, it's not. That's the root to madness, to dysfunction, and to living a terrible life. So yes, I see a lot of it in, I've gone head to head with a lot of, trolls in the men's rights movement and MGTOW and all those different areas, and that's, one of the things is that it comes up again and again is, yes, I'm going to be Stoic, but they only see life as being miserable. Whereas I think the Stoics was, life is a blank slate, and yes, good things and bad things happen, and you take everything as it comes, and there's a joy in that. And I don't think it's not a surprise that people in some of these men's rights movements focus on just life as being miserable, and women are there to deceive you, and other men are just the competition. It's no wonder that they kind of burn out and flame out and just lead miserable lives.
Ari, where are you seeing it come up today? as you're in a different sort of position than we are.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would say that this kind of popular version that Anthony is talking about is the thing that you see the most often. Well, I guess I should first say, in its own time, right, classical Stoicism was incredibly popular, right? It was the kind of pop philosophy of its day. It's no joke when you have Marcus Aurelius as one of your philosophers. But the thing that is sort of most noteworthy too is not simply what Anthony is saying about this kind of repressing one's emotions as the kind of be all and end all of kind of modern Stoicism. But what's noticeably absent is what you were talking about a few minutes ago, Matt. In that discussion, there's no mention of virtue, right? Like that doesn't appear. It's simply an individualistic doctrine about not feeling anything and internalizing any pain that you might have in your life, so that in some sense, kind of pretending that you don't feel it, right? But there's no thinking about the kind of outside world, how one might interact virtuously with it, right? And that is really a principle of Stoicism that so many people today ignore, right? Because they take the reductive version of it only, right? Which is this lack of emotion and a kind of, I guess a kind of cynicism about the way that the world works, right? And how it kind of it just beats us down, and the best we can do is but not feel how we feel, right? That becomes the be all and end all of Stoicism when you ignore the component that addresses virtuous living.
Yeah, I see.
And you can't have but you can't have virtuous living without other people. You can't. You need it's this other. You're exactly right. It's this lack of other focus and the realizing that you need this social commerce. So Stoicism sort of been bastardized by this rugged individualism, sort of where it's like, it's you alone against the world, and everyone else is dumb and stupid and they're out of control, and so it's removed that whole other person component, and it's totally separate from what it really should be as far as virtuous living is concerned.
Yeah, I think that's been a good sort of point for me to hear in this is that idea that it does seem to be presented as an individual internal thing. It's almost a coping mechanism for the world. I think Tim Ferriss and maybe some others have described it as a personal operating system, which is great. But if it's an operating system to just sort of survive and thrive in the crazy world rather than or at the exclusion of thinking about others, because I think it is very important to have that individual internal solidity or rigidity, so that you can help those around you and can focus on those around you and focus on a virtuous life. So I wonder what or if a lot of the modern authors and practitioners would say about their virtuous contribution to the world.
I think they miss it, right? Because in some ways they reduce Stoicism to a kind of cynicism, right? And if you're a cynic, you're not interested in concepts like virtue, right? Because virtue is fundamentally not a cynical concept, right? And this idea of a philosophy that is both about a kind of self, I don't know, I guess the way people think of it today is a kind of conquering oneself, right? A mastery of oneself or whatever, conquering one's emotions, one's feelings. If you reduce it simply to that, and then you say the reason I have to behave this way is because the world is, or nature is fundamentally at odds with me. and I have to find a way to live with that, right? And the way to do that is self-mastery. Then one is living much more of a cynical life than a Stoic life, right? One's Stoicism is simply a reaction to one's cynicism, and there's no place for engagement with the other. There's no social intercourse in such a cynical world. People get in your way, or people make things harder for you. Interactions with other people are a thing that you have to armor yourself against in some ways. So there's not a lot of time spent thinking carefully about what virtuous living would entail, because that's not a project for cynics. Any kind of talk about virtue is fundamentally not cynical.
Yeah. I want to get us finished here within the allotted time. So I'll leave you each with one sort of last thought, and maybe address how viewers could get into reading about Stoicism. If there's a text that you suggest, or one of the philosophers that's easier to get into than the others. Anthony, you want to take a stab at that?
So to say, I think, here we go. Can you see that?
No.
Marcus Aurelius? Yeah, Marcus Aurelius. I would say Meditations. Pick up Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. That's sort of like one of my Bibles that I carry around with me. I would say Marcus Aurelius would be a great spot. I think he's pretty accessible. Meditations is sort of a classic of it, so I would say go there and just really brush up on what it really meant to be a Stoic. And actually, cynicism has roots, I think, that are, if they're related somehow. I'm not quite sure off the top of my head how cynicism and Stoicism are related, but maybe cynicism was an earlier form that sort of was more individualistic, and then I think it evolved into, but don't quote me on that, but do your research, people, and maybe kind of look that up. But I would say yes, Meditations, Marcus Aurelius, and don't buy into this modern version where it's the world is just miserable and you need to be the smartest guy or person in the room and everyone else is an idiot. That's not Stoicism. That's modern degraded cynic being a cynic. Yeah. All
right. And I think Meditations is interesting to point out that it was the most powerful man in the world's diary to himself, right? He wasn't writing it to be published, and so there's a real it's a really interesting perspective to be reading about the philosophy from. Ari, close it up for us.
I would point you in the same direction. I think Marcus Aurelius is quite accessible. I think you also can't go wrong reading Seneca. But also, I'll be perfectly honest, primary sources are hard. And so you also can't go wrong by taking a look at like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and checking out, an essay about Stoicism. That will give you a really good primer. It's a great first cut, and it's written in a kind of layperson's language. Right, so you don't have to be a professional philosopher to go and look at Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's very well written, and it's very well sourced. Right, so it'll point you in all sorts of directions based on what you find most interesting in the entry on Stoicism. So I actually recommend that. I think that there are some, that's a really good internet resource, and it's free, and it points you in all kinds of directions if you want to go and purchase something from there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both very much for your time, and no doubt we'll see you again on the podcast sometime this year. Thanks again.
Thank you, Matt. Anthony, great to see you.
Yeah.